The crack of the whip was the last sound of her old life. The first sound of her new one was Jedediah's voice, thick and greasy as the axle grease he smeared on his wagon wheels. "This is as far as you go, girl!" Luzia scrambled to her feet in the red dust, the hem of her worn calico dress catching on a thorny bush. The wagon, her passage to a rumored cousin in Santa Fe, stood stark against the bleached blue sky. Jedediah, a man whose belly strained the buttons of his grimy shirt, spat a brown stream of tobacco juice near her boots. His eyes, small and buried in a fleshy face, held a mean little glint of satisfaction. "I paid my fare, Mr. Crab," she said, her voice steadier than her trembling hands. "Fare covers passage, not comforts." He grunted. "A man has needs on a long trail. You ain't willing to be agreeable." Agreeable. That was the word he'd used last night. His whiskey-sour breath hot on her face as he cornered her by the campfire. He'd seen her not as a passenger, but as property that came with the fee. Her refusal, a quiet but firm "no, sir," had been met with a dark look that promised consequences. This was it. He tossed her small, cloth-wrapped bundle onto the ground. It landed with a soft thud, sending up a puff of ochre dust. "Get clear of my wagon." He didn't wait for her to move. The whip cracked again, this time over the backs of the weary mules, and the wagon lurched forward, its wheels groaning in protest. It shrank into the shimmering heat of the Texas plains, leaving Luzia utterly alone. The silence that descended was a physical weight. It was broken only by the whisper of a hot wind moving through brittle sagebrush and the distant, lonely cry of a hawk circling in the vast emptiness above. She stood in a world painted in shades of rust and sun-faded green. The ground was a mosaic of cracked red earth, thirsty for a rain that never seemed to come. Skeletal arms of saguaro cacti reached for the sky like desperate prophets, their shadows offering no real shade. The sun was not a gentle warmth. It was a hammer, beating down relentlessly, bleaching the color from everything it touched. She picked up her bundle, a pathetic collection of a spare dress, a half-eaten loaf of stale bread, and a small tin of water. Her mother, a gentle Mexican woman who had loved a black soldier passing through San Antonio, had always warned her of the world's harshness. "Mija," she'd say, her hands weaving intricate patterns into a basket. "Your skin tells two stories. Some people will only ever read one of them, and they will read it with hate." Her mother was gone now, taken by a fever that swept through the poorer quarters. Her father was a ghost, a name in a letter, long since vanished into the country's wars. And now, Luzia was a story with no one left to read it. She started walking, following the faint ruts of the wagon trail. There was nothing else to do. To stay put was to die. To walk was to have a chance. Thirst came first, a dry, scratchy feeling at the back of her throat that the few sips of warm water from her tin did little to quench. Then came the hunger, a hollow ache in her belly that twisted into sharp cramps. The bread was gone by midday, each crumb a treasure she chewed slowly, trying to make it last. But fear was a worse companion than hunger or thirst. It was a cold snake coiled in her gut, a constant, chilling presence even in the suffocating heat. This was a land that had no place for a woman like her. Alone and unprotected, every shadow could hold a threat. Every rock could hide a rattlesnake or a man with cruelty in his heart. She saw no one, yet she felt 1,000 eyes on her. The land itself seemed hostile, its vast, empty spaces a testament to her own insignificance. She was a single, dark speck on an unforgiving canvas, easily erased. By the second day, her lips were cracked and bleeding. The water was long gone. Her tongue felt thick and swollen in her mouth. The world had begun to tilt and swim before her eyes. The horizon shimmered and danced, playing cruel tricks, promising water where there was only more dry, cracked earth. It was then that she saw it. Not a mirage, but the low, dirt-caked roof of a building, a way station. Hope, a dangerous and fragile thing, fluttered in her chest. She stumbled toward it, her worn leather boots scuffing through the dust. It was a ramshackle place, a lean-to and a small stable huddled together as if for comfort against the oppressive emptiness. A few sorry-looking horses stood listlessly in a corral. The sound of rough laughter and the clink of a bottle reached her before she even got to the door. She hesitated. The fear in her belly tightened its coils, but the thirst was a raging fire. She had to take the risk. Pushing open the creaking door, she stepped into a dim, foul-smelling room. It smelled of stale beer, unwashed bodies, and despair. 4 men sat around a crude wooden table, a half-empty bottle of whiskey between them. They were trail-worn and hard-faced, their eyes instantly fixing on her as she entered. The laughter died. The air grew thick. "Well now," one of them drawled, a man with a tangled, greasy beard. "Look what the wind blew in." Lucia kept her eyes downcast.
"Water,"
she rasped, her voice a dry croak.
"Please, I can pay."
She reached for the few coins tied in a knot in her handkerchief. Another man, younger but with the same cruel set to his mouth, stood up. He was large, his shoulders blocking the light from the doorway. "We got water, and other things a pretty little thing like you might need." He took a step closer. The smell of him, sweat and cheap whiskey, made her stomach clench.
"Just water, sir,"
she repeated, trying to keep her voice from shaking. The big man chuckled, a low, ugly sound. "A little slip of a thing like you shouldn't be wandering alone," he said, his eyes roaming over her, making her feel stripped bare. He reached out and grabbed her arm. His grip was like an iron band. "Place is cold at night. Let's get you comfortable in the barn. Plenty of soft hay in there." The other men snickered. They made no move to help. They were spectators to a sport they all understood. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of her exhaustion. This was Jedediah all over again. But worse, there was no wagon to be thrown from, no trail to escape to. This was the end of the line. His hand tightened, and he began to pull her toward the back door, toward the barn. Her mind screamed. Her mother's voice, a faint echo from a lifetime ago.
"Never let them think you are helpless. Mija, you are not."
Her free hand darted down to her right boot. Tucked inside, against her calf, was a small, sharp knife. It was a skinning knife, a gift from her father she'd never known, passed on by her mother with the instruction to always keep it close. It wasn't much, but it was hers. With a surge of adrenaline, she pulled the knife free. The man was dragging her, laughing at her feeble struggles. He didn't see the glint of steel. She twisted, bringing her arm around, and slashed upwards. The blade, honed to a razor's edge, sliced across the back of his hand. He roared, a sound of surprise as much as pain, and his grip loosened for a split second. It was all she needed. She wrenched her arm free and bolted. She didn't run for the front door. She ran for the back, straight into the blinding sunlight. She scrambled over a broken fence, her dress tearing, and plunged into the sparse, thorny wilderness behind the station. Shouts erupted behind her. "Get her!" She didn't look back. She ran with the desperate, lung-burning speed of a hunted animal. Branches whipped at her face. Thorns tore at her skin, but she didn't feel it. All she felt was the pounding of her heart against her ribs and the raw terror that propelled her forward. She ran until the sounds of the men faded, until her legs felt like lead and her lungs were on fire. She ran until she could run no more. She finally stumbled to a halt in a rocky ravine. At the edge of what had once been a creek, the bed was now just a winding scar of pale, smooth stones and sun-baked mud. Her body gave out. Her knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the hard ground, the small knife clattering from her numb fingers. The world around her, the harsh rocks and the indifferent sky, began to spin and darken at the edges. Her last conscious thought was of water, a cool, clear sip of water. Then, the blackness took her completely. She was discovered as the sun began to bleed across the western sky, painting the clouds in hues of orange and violet. He saw her from a ridge above the ravine, a crumpled heap of calico that didn't belong in the landscape. Elias urged his horse, a steady buckskin gelding, down the treacherous slope. He dismounted in silence, his movements economical and precise. He was not a large man, but he carried a stillness that gave him weight. His face was a map of hard miles and harder years, carved by sun and wind. A thick, dusty mustache concealed a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, took in the scene without expression. The girl, unconscious and perilously close to death, the small knife lying in the dust beside her. He knelt, his worn leather chaps creaking. He pressed 2 fingers against the side of her neck. A pulse, faint, thready, but there. He looked at her face, half hidden by a mess of tangled, dark hair. Her skin was the color of rich coffee and cream, her features a delicate blend of her 2 peoples. He noted the scratches on her cheeks and the torn fabric of her dress. She was running from something. "Out here, everyone was—" With a quiet grunt, he uncorked his canteen and gently wet his handkerchief. He dabbed it on her cracked lips, then on her forehead. She stirred, a low moan escaping her, but didn't wake. There was no question of leaving her. It wasn't in him. It didn't matter who she was or what trouble she was in. You didn't leave a person to the coyotes and the buzzards. It was one of the few simple rules left in a complicated world. Effortlessly, he lifted her into his arms. She weighed next to nothing, a bundle of bones and desperation. He carried her to his horse, mounted, and settled her in front of him, her head lolling against his chest. He clicked his tongue, and the horse began the slow, steady walk back toward the east, back toward a solitary homestead that had not known the presence of another soul in a very long time. Elias held the reins with one hand, his other arm securely around the unconscious girl, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his face a stony mask of a man long accustomed to carrying the weight of loss. The first thing she was aware of was the smell, not the metallic scent of her own fear or the cloying sweetness of dust, but the clean, sharp aroma of pine wood and wood smoke. It was a scent of hearth and home, something she hadn't known in so long it felt like a memory from someone else's life. Lucia's eyes fluttered open. She wasn't on the hard, stony ground of the dry creek bed. She was lying on a narrow cot, a coarse but clean wool blanket pulled up to her chin. Above her, rough-hewn wooden beams formed a ceiling, stained dark with years of smoke. She turned her head slowly, her muscles aching in protest. She was in a room that seemed to be a kitchen, a living space, and a bedroom all in one. It was a place built of necessity, not comfort. The walls were made of thick, unfinished logs, the gaps chinked with a mixture of mud and grass that had dried and crumbled in places. Through these small fissures, thin slivers of morning light pierced the gloom like golden needles. A steady, mournful wind whistled through a nearby window frame, a perfect square cut into the wall that held no glass. Only a worn wooden shutter propped open to the vast, empty landscape outside. A stone fireplace, large enough to stand in, dominated one wall. It was cold now, a thin trickle of smoke curling up from the embers of a long dead fire. A simple, sturdy table and 2 chairs stood in the center of the room, on a shelf. A few tin plates were neatly stacked next to a handful of mismatched utensils. The room was stark, stripped of anything that wasn't essential for survival. There were no pictures, no curtains, no softened edges. It was a man's space. But more than that, it was the space of a man who had given up on the idea of a home and settled for mere shelter. It felt less lived in than haunted by an absence. A wave of dizziness washed over her as she sat up. Her throat was still raw, but the raging fire of her thirst had been banked. A tin cup of cool water sat on a small crate beside the cot. She drank it greedily, the water a miracle on her tongue. Her bundle was there, too, placed neatly beside the cup, and her knife. It was clean. wiped of the evidence of its desperate use, its blade catching a slime of light. The fact that it had been left for her, that it hadn't been taken, was a silent message she couldn't yet decipher. Fear, her old companion, returned. Who had brought her here? The man from the way station? Had he tracked her down? But that didn't make sense. This place felt different. It was quiet, isolated, a fortress of solitude. The violence of the way station felt a world away. This was the home of the silent, grim-faced man on the horse, a rescuer, or a captor. In her world, the line between the two was often perilously thin. She had to prove she wasn't a burden. That was the first rule of survival for someone like her. You made yourself useful. You earned your keep. You made them need you before they had a chance to hate you. Pushing the scratchy blanket aside, she swung her legs over the side of the cot. Her body was weak, protesting every movement, but her will was a hard, unyielding stone inside her. She found a broom made of bundled twigs in a corner and began to sweep the wooden floor. The act was methodical, calming. She swept away the dust and tracked in dirt, creating small patterns of order in the room's deep-set loneliness. As she worked, she took stock of her surroundings. The cabin was small, just this main room and what looked like a small, curtained-off sleeping alcove in the back. Adjacent to the fireplace was a small pantry, its door a simple plank of wood. She opened it cautiously. The shelves held the staples of a solitary life: a large sack of flour, another of cornmeal, a barrel of pinto beans, a slab of salt pork hanging from a hook, a few shriveled onions, and a tin of coffee. But tucked away on a higher shelf, almost forgotten, was a small cloth bag. She reached for it, her fingers closing around its contents. She brought it to her nose. The scent was unmistakable. Dried chilies, cumin, a hint of oregano, spices from her mother's kitchen, a ghost of a world of warmth and flavor in this desolate place. An idea, a purpose, took root. She wouldn't just be a patient, a stray taken in from the wilderness. She would be a cook. She would repay his kindness, or at least his lack of cruelty, the only way she knew how. She set to work. She built up the fire, her hands surprisingly steady as she coaxed the embers back to life. She put a pot of beans on to boil, adding one of the precious dried chilies. With practiced ease, she mixed cornmeal with water and a pinch of salt, her hands shaping the mesa into perfect, round discs. The rhythmic pat-pat-pat of her hands was a comforting sound, a rhythm of life in the crushing silence. Soon, the cabin began to change. The air, once thin and smelling only of dust and solitude, grew thick with the rich, earthy aroma of simmering beans, the sharp, smoky scent of chili, and the warm, toasty fragrance of tortillas cooking on a cast-iron skillet over the open flame. The food was simple, born of scarcity, but it was seasoned with memory and a desperate hope. As she cooked, she felt a piece of herself returning, a strength that had nothing to do with muscle and everything to do with the quiet dignity of providing. She was bringing life back into this house, or perhaps bringing it here for the very first time. When Elias returned at dusk, he smelled it from 100 yards away. He was leading his horse to the stable when the scent reached him, stopping him dead in his tracks. It was a warm, savory smell, complex and utterly foreign to his homestead. For 5 years, the only thing his cabin had ever smelled of was his own cooking, bland, functional, the taste of survival. This was different. This was the smell of a meal made with care. He approached the cabin slowly, his hand resting instinctively on the colt at his hip. He pushed the door open. The scene that greeted him was so alien he stood frozen in the doorway for a full second. The room was warm, filled with a soft, flickering glow from the fireplace and an oil lamp she had found and lit on the table. The floor was clean, and the girl he had carried back from the edge of death, was standing by the hearth, her back to him, turning a tortilla on the skillet. The table was set for two. 2 tin plates, 2 forks, 2 cups. It was an act of audacious assumption. An invitation he hadn't offered. Yet it wasn't insolent. It was hopeful. Lucia heard the door creak, and her heart leaped into her throat. She turned slowly, her face framed by the warm firelight. She looked younger now, less like a hunted animal and more like a person. Her eyes were wide, uncertain. Neither of them spoke. Elias moved into the room, taking off his dusty hat and hanging it on a peg by the door. His movements were deliberate, unhurried. He washed his hands and face in a basin of water she had left on a stool, the splashing sound loud in the quiet room. Then he sat down at the table. It was a silent command. She brought the food, a plate of steaming tortillas, a bowl of the thick, fragrant beans, and a few slices of fried salt pork. They ate in a silence as vast and profound as the plains outside. The only sounds were the scrape of their forks on the tin plates, the crackle of the fire, and the steady, sawing chorus of crickets that had begun their nightly sermon. The lamplight cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, making the small room feel like the only inhabited place in the entire world. Lucia barely tasted her food. She watched him from under her lashes, trying to read the unreadable landscape of his face. He ate steadily, his expression unchanging, but she saw the way he paused after the first bite of the beans. It was just a flicker, a momentary stillness, but it was there. He was tasting the chili, the cumin, the faint hint of her mother's hands. He was tasting a life that was not his own. His late wife, Martha, had been a good woman, a woman of the plains, but her cooking had been as plain as her name, boiled potatoes and tough beef. She had never understood spices, had viewed them with suspicion, as something foreign and unnecessary. When the last of the food was gone, Elias pushed his plate back and finally looked at her, his gaze direct and unnerving. His voice, when he spoke, was raspy, like stones grinding together. "What's your name?"
"Lucia, sir."
He considered the name for a moment, then gave a slight nod.
"Where you from?"
This was it, the question that always came, the one that determined everything. She could lie, she could invent a story, a safe and simple one, but looking into his weary, clear eyes, she found she couldn't. He had saved her life. He deserved the truth, whatever the consequences. She took a shallow breath.
"I was born near San Antonio. My mother, she was from Mexico. My father—"
She hesitated, her voice dropping to a near whisper.
"My father was a colored soldier. He was enlisted."
She laid the words out like stones on the table, the plain, unvarnished facts of her existence. A half-breed, a woman belonging to two worlds and welcome in neither. She watched his face, bracing herself for the change, for the hardening of his eyes, the tightening of his jaw, the inevitable dismissal. In her experience, the revelation was always followed by revulsion. But Elias's expression did not change. He didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He simply sat there, absorbing her words, the flickering lamplight carving deep shadows into the lines on his face. The silence stretched, pulling taut between them. She could hear the frantic beating of her own heart. He was looking at her, really looking. And for the first time, she felt he wasn't just seeing the color of her skin, but the entirety of her, a survivor sitting across a table she had set herself. Finally, he spoke again, his voice still low and rough. "You can stay a few days, till you get your strength back." The relief that flooded through her was so immense it almost made her weep. It was a reprieve, a temporary stay against the world's harsh sentence, a few days of safety. It was more than she had dared to hope for. The gratitude was a painful lump in her throat, but years of caution and the ingrained need to prove her worth wouldn't let her accept his charity without a price. She was not a pet, nor a child. She had to have a function, a reason to be allowed to exist in his space. She clasped her hands together in her lap to stop their trembling. Her voice was barely audible, a thread of sound in the quiet room, freighted with the weight of a lifetime of apologies. "I ain't white, sir, but I can cook." It was all she had to offer. It was a confession and a plea, an acknowledgement of her perceived flaw and a statement of her only tangible skill. Elias looked at her for a long time. His gaze was heavy, profound. He looked at her trembling hands, at the fear and fierce pride warring in her dark eyes, at the plate she had filled with food that had, for a brief moment, chased some of the ghosts from his house. He saw it all. He gave a slow, single nod. That's enough for now. The few days he had offered her bled into a week, then 2, marked not by the calendar but by the slow, subtle transformation of the homestead. The silence that had once seemed absolute in its desolation was now punctuated by new sounds, the scrape of a hoe against dry earth, the soft slap of dough being worked on the kitchen table, the low hum of a song her mother used to sing. Luzia moved through the space not as a guest, but as if she were a vital organ the house had been missing, slowly restoring its circulation. She found a small, neglected vegetable patch behind the cabin, choked with weeds and baked hard by the sun, with a resolve that defied the heat. She spent hours turning the soil, her hands finding a forgotten rhythm. In a dusty crate in the stable, she discovered a tin of old seeds. Most were duds, but a few stubborn squash and bean seeds sprouted under her patient care, their tender green shoots a defiant splash of life against the red earth. The stable, too, felt her touch. A loose board that had rattled in the wind for years was hammered firmly into place. The water trough, slimy with algae, was scrubbed clean. Elias's buckskin gelding, a creature as taciturn as its owner, began to nicker softly when she approached, nudging her hand in search of the occasional stolen bit of apple core. Inside the cabin, the change was even more profound. The smell of baking cornbread now clung to the wooden walls, a warm, comforting scent that overpowered the lingering ghosts of loneliness. She mended Elias's work shirts, her stitches small and neat. The kitchen, once merely a place for the functional preparation of fuel, became a hearth, a center of warmth and life that radiated out into the rest of the small structure. Elias watched it all from his silent, guarded world. At first, he'd felt the intrusion of her presence as a disruption, a foreign element in the hermetically sealed container of his grief. But he could not deny the change. He could not deny the simple, undeniable pleasure of returning from a long day of mending fences to a hot meal that tasted of more than just survival. His silence began to crack. It started with simple things. He'd answer her questions about the land with more than a one-word reply. "That ridge," he said one evening, gesturing with his chin toward the dark silhouette of the hills, "is where the Comanche used to signal. Before." He didn't need to explain what before meant. He had lived in a fortress of solitude ever since the fire. It had taken everything. His wife, Martha, and their 5-year-old son, Daniel. They had been in the original cabin, the one that stood where a blackened scar of earth and a few foundation stones now remained. He'd been out rounding up stray cattle when the storm rolled in, a dry lightning strike setting the prairie ablaze. By the time he saw the smoke and raced back, it was too late. He had rebuilt a little further down the creek, but the new cabin was just a shell. The home had burned with them. He never spoke of it directly, but Luzia pieced the story together from the fragments he let fall, a bitter comment about the treachery of summer lightning, a long, vacant stare at the fireplace one night, his hand clenched into a fist. She learned that his silence wasn't born of coldness, but of a pain so vast it had consumed all his words. And as he began, haltingly, to speak to her, she found herself listening with an intensity that surprised her. She learned the names of the constellations he pointed out in the clear, star-dusted sky. She learned the habits of the coyotes, whose yips and howls stitched the night together. He, in turn, started to ask about her. Not about her parents or the circumstances that had left her stranded, but about the small things. He asked her how she knew which wild herbs were good for seasoning, and he listened, truly listened, as she told him about her mother's kitchen, her voice soft with memory. The evenings became a ritual. After the supper dishes were cleaned and stacked, they would sit on the narrow porch, two silent figures watching the day die and the moon rise. The vast, empty landscape that had once terrified her now felt different, imbued with a stark and lonely beauty. It was on one of these nights that something shifted in Elias. The moon was a perfect silver dollar in a black velvet sky. Its light so bright it bleached the color from the plains and cast sharp, dark shadows. The light caught Lucia as she leaned against a porch post, her profile outlined in silver. It softened the lines of exhaustion and fear that were usually etched around her eyes, and it shimmered on her dark skin, making it look like polished bronze. Elias looked at her, and for the first time, he wasn't seeing a stray he'd rescued, or a good cook, or a capable helper. He was seeing a woman. He saw the graceful curve of her neck, the quiet strength in her hands as they rested in her lap, the way her dark eyes reflected the endless sea of stars above them. A feeling he had thought long dead and buried with his family stirred in the ashes of his heart, a faint, flickering warmth that was both terrifying and undeniably real. He realized, with a jolt that went deeper than thought, that she was not just good or kind. She was beautiful. His gaze changed after that. He would watch her as she worked, a new intensity in his pale eyes that she could feel on her skin like a physical touch. It wasn't the leering, possessive look she'd known from other men. This was different. It was quieter, deeper, and infinitely more confusing. It was a look of discovery, tinged with a profound sadness. He said nothing, his wall of silence rebuilding itself around this new, unspoken thing. But the tension was there, a low hum beneath the surface of their quiet days. Then the storm came. It blew in from the north without warning, a churning wall of bruised purple clouds that swallowed the sun and turned the afternoon to twilight. The wind hit first, a physical blow that shrieked around the corners of the cabin and tore at the stable roof. Then came the rain. Not in drops, but in solid, driving sheets that hammered against the wooden walls. The glassless window, usually a welcome source of air, became a gaping mouth, spewing wind and water into the kitchen. "The tarp!" Elias yelled over the roar of the storm, grabbing a heavy oiled canvas that was stored behind the door. "Help me!" They stumbled out onto the porch, instantly soaked. The wind was a malevolent beast, ripping and pulling at the canvas, threatening to tear it from their grasp. Elias fought his way to one side of the window frame, Lucia to the other, the rain plastering her thin dress to her body and blurring her vision. "On three, pull it tight!" he shouted. They worked together against the fury of the storm, a desperate, clumsy ballet. The wind caught the tarp like a sail, flinging Lucia off balance. She slipped on the wet porch boards, and for a terrifying second, she felt herself falling. But Elias was there. He lunged, his body shielding hers from the worst of the wind, and his hand shot out to steady her. His hand closed over hers, pinning it, and the canvas, to the rough log wall. The world stopped. The roar of the storm, the sting of the rain, the howling wind, it all faded away to a distant hum. All she could feel was the sudden, shocking heat of his hand covering hers. It was a large hand, calloused and strong, the hand of a man who worked the land. But there was a gentleness in the way he held her, a steady pressure that was protective, not punishing. It was the first time a man had touched her without the intent to harm or take. It was the first human touch she'd felt in years that offered only support. A jolt, sharp and electric, shot up her arm, straight to her heart. They stood frozen for a long second, his hand over hers, their eyes locked. In his gaze, she saw a maelstrom that rivaled the storm outside, surprise, confusion, and a raw, unguarded longing that mirrored the ache in her own soul. He let go as if burned, turning his attention back to securing the tarp, his movement suddenly jerky and uncertain. They finished the job in a new, charged silence. That night, sleep would not come for Lucia. She lay on her cot, listening to the rain drumming on the roof, her body still humming with the memory of his touch. It was a dangerous feeling. Her life had taught her that a man's touch was a prelude to pain, a claim of ownership. She had built walls around herself, stone by stone, to keep that danger out. But his touch hadn't felt like a threat. It had felt like an anchor, and that terrified her more than anything. A fierce, unfamiliar yearning rose within her, a longing for a connection she had never allowed herself to want. It was a treacherous hope, a seed of warmth in the frozen ground of her heart, and she didn't know if she could survive it blooming. Outside, on the rain-lashed porch, Elias leaned against a post, a half-empty bottle of whiskey in his hand. He stared out into the churning darkness, the wind whipping his hair and tugging at his coat. The touch had undone him. It had breached the walls he had so carefully constructed around his grief. The simple, accidental contact had felt more intimate than any embrace. He took a long pull from the bottle, the liquor burning a path down his throat but doing nothing to numb the turmoil inside him. The wind howled through the pines, and in its mournful, keening cry, he heard the ghost of his wife's voice. Martha. He saw her face, laughing in the sunlight. He felt the phantom weight of his son's hand in his. The past was a physical presence, a pack of wolves circling him in the dark. But then, another image intruded. Lucia's face, her dark eyes wide and startled in the storm. The feeling of her small, surprisingly strong hand under his. She was life. She was the smell of baking bread and the sight of green shoots in his dead garden. She was a present that was actively, terrifyingly, trying to overwrite his past. He closed his eyes, his knuckles white around the neck of the bottle. The wind howled again, a long, lonely cry that sounded like a name being called across an impossible distance. He didn't know if it was the ghost of his wife calling him back, or the sound of his own breaking heart. The days after the storm fell into a new rhythm, a quiet dance of awareness. The air between Lucia and Elias was thick with the unspoken memory of that touch on the porch. They moved around each other with a careful grace, their solitude now shared, their silences no longer empty but filled with a fragile, resonant tension. The homestead, which had once felt like Elias's fortress against the world, now felt like a world of its own, containing just the two of them. This fragile peace was shattered on a blistering afternoon a week later. A cloud of red dust on the horizon announced the arrival of the riders long before they appeared. Elias, who had been reshoeing his horse, straightened up, his body going still, his eyes narrowing. Lucia, who was hanging laundry on a line she'd strung between the cabin and a gnarled juniper tree, felt a familiar knot of dread tighten in her stomach. Visitors were a threat. The outside world was a threat. 3 men rode into the yard, their horses kicking up dust that settled on Lucia's clean sheets. They were local ranchers, their faces hard and sun-cured, their eyes holding the casual arrogance of men who believed the land and everything on it belonged to them. Their leader, a thick-set man with a sneer permanently etched onto his face named Caleb, swung down from his saddle. "Elias," he said, his voice a gravelly drawl. "Heard you might have a spare gelding for sale. Our man Hank here got his horse lamed up in a gopher hole." Elias didn't move from his spot by the stable. "Might," he said, his voice flat and non-committal. "Depends on the price." Caleb's eyes slid past Elias and fixed on Lucia. He took in her dark skin, her simple dress, the way she stood frozen by the laundry line. A slow, ugly grin spread across his face. He nudged one of his companions, a lanky man with vacant eyes. "Well, now, look at this," Caleb said, his voice dripping with condescending amusement. He looked back at Elias, his grin widening. "Didn't know you'd taken on new help. Where'd you pick that up? Elias?
Out of the sugar fields down south?
The other men chuckled, the sound coarse and cruel in the quiet yard. Lucia felt their eyes on her like a physical violation. The familiar, sickening shame and fear washed over her, a cold tide that threatened to pull her under. She wanted to run, to disappear into the walls of the cabin, but her feet felt rooted to the spot. She stood her ground, her chin held high, her hands clutching a damp bedsheet like a shield. Caleb took a swaggering step toward her. He was close enough now that she could smell the sour scent of sweat and leather. "What's the matter, girl? Cat got your tongue?" Elias's voice cut through the air, cold and sharp as splintered ice. "State your business, Caleb, or ride out." Caleb held up his hands in mock surrender, though his eyes never left Lucia. "Just being neighborly, admiring your property." He reached out, his hand moving with deliberate slowness, aiming to swat her on the hip as one might a horse or a dog. "A fine piece of—" He never finished the sentence. There was no warning, no shouted threat. One moment, Ellis was standing by the stable, his hands empty. The next, his Colt revolver was in his fist, the muzzle leveled dead center on Caleb's chest. The movement had been a blur, a fluid, economical motion that spoke of long and lethal practice. The click of the hammer being cocked was deafening in the sudden, absolute silence. Caleb froze, his hand hovering in the air. The sneer vanished from his face, replaced by a look of stunned disbelief, which quickly curdled into fear as he looked into Elias's eyes. They were not angry. They were utterly, terrifyingly empty of all emotion, as cold and gray as a winter sky over a fresh grave. Elias spoke, his voice dangerously soft, each word a chip of granite. "She's my bride." The words hung in the hot, still air, as shocking and improbable as a clap of thunder from a clear sky. Caleb and his men stared, their mouths agape. Lucia's heart stopped. The sheet slipped from her numb fingers and fell into the red dust. Bride. The word echoed in the ringing silence of her mind. Foreign and sacred. It was a word for white women in clean churches, a word from a world she could only ever look at from the outside. A choked, nervous laugh escaped one of the other men. Caleb found his voice, though it was a few notes higher than before. Your bride? You gone loco. Elias? Since when do you take a wife from a cotton patch?" "Since I decided it was my business," Elias said, his voice unchanged, the gun unwavering. "Not yours. Now get off my land." Caleb stared for another long second at the black, unblinking eye of the Colt's muzzle, then at the chilling emptiness in Elias's face. He was a bully and a coward, and he knew a killing look when he saw one. He backed away slowly, his hands held up. "All right, Elias, all right. No need to get heated." He scrambled back onto his horse, never turning his back completely. His companions followed suit, their earlier bravado gone, replaced by a wary haste. "Crazy old goat," Caleb muttered, just loud enough to be heard, as he wheeled his horse around, defiling his wife's memory with that. They spurred their horses and galloped out of the yard, leaving a thick, choking cloud of dust in their wake. The silence they left behind was heavier than the one they had broken. Lucia stood trembling, the world tilting on its axis. She stared at Elias, who slowly, deliberately, lowered the hammer on his revolver and slid it back into its holster. He didn't look at her. He turned and went back to the horse's hoof he'd been working on, his shoulders tense. She found her voice, a reedy, shaking whisper. What did you say?" He kept his back to her, picking up a rasp and drawing it across the hoof. The metallic scraping sound was grating. Loud. "You heard me." She walked toward him, her legs unsteady. The dust settled around them. "Why?" she demanded, a new strength born of desperation rising in her. She needed to understand. She couldn't live with that word hanging between them if it was a lie. "You said that to save me, or is it—" She couldn't finish the question. She couldn't dare to voice the impossible hope that was clawing its way up her throat. Elias stopped his work. He dropped the rasp and stood up to his full height. He turned to face her, and the look in his eyes made her breath catch. The cold emptiness was gone, replaced by the raging storm she had seen on the night of the rain, a tempest of pain and longing and a fierce, wild emotion she couldn't name. He didn't speak. Words were useless for what was inside him. He closed the distance between them in 2 long strides. His hands came up, not to grab or to hold, but to gently, reverently, cup her face. His calloused thumbs stroked her cheekbones as if he were memorizing the feel of her. And then he kissed her. It was not a gentle kiss. It was a kiss of desperation, of starvation. It was the kiss of a man drowning and finding air, of a woman lost in the desert and finding water. It was deep and hard and punishingly honest, filled with all the loneliness and grief and simmering need that had been buried in both of them for years. It was a kiss that didn't ask, but claimed, a raw and desperate collision of 2 broken souls who had forgotten what it felt like to be whole. She tasted whiskey and sorrow and a deep, aching tenderness on his lips. She wrapped her arms around his neck, clinging to him, her own pent-up grief and terror and a lifetime of unfulfilled yearning pouring into the kiss. When they finally broke apart, they were both breathless, their foreheads resting against each other. The sun beat down on them, but they were in their own world, sheltered by the magnitude of what had just passed between them. That night, they came together not as lovers in the throes of a giddy romance, but as 2 survivors clinging to a piece of wreckage in a stormy sea. In the dim flickering light of the oil lamp, they undressed each other with hesitant, trembling hands. There was a profound sadness in the act, an almost painful vulnerability. Every touch was a question, every caress an answer. He traced the old, faded scars on her back, souvenirs of a harsh life, and she felt the rigid, corded muscles in his shoulders, the physical manifestation of the burdens he carried. Their lovemaking was a silent, desperate conversation. It was a raw, aching union, a fierce and tender battle against the ghosts that haunted them both. It was the heat of her skin against his, the tangle of their limbs, the sound of their breathing filling the silence of the cabin. It was a frantic, almost agonizing attempt to pour all of their unspoken pain and hope and fear into the simple, profound act of 2 bodies becoming one. In his arms, she was not a half-breed, not a stray. She was a woman, desired and cherished. In her embrace, he was not a widower, not a hermit nursing his grief. He was a man, alive and feeling. They were 2 outcasts, 2 lonely souls, finding a frantic, temporary salvation in each other's flesh, building a fortress of warmth and life against the cold, uncaring world outside. Lucia fell into a deep, exhausted sleep, curled against his side, a feeling of safety and belonging so new and overwhelming it felt like a dream. When she woke, the first pale light of dawn was filtering through the unshuttered window. The place beside her in the cot was empty and cold. Panic, swift and icy, seized her. It had been a dream, a cruel, beautiful dream. He was gone. He had taken what he wanted and left, just like all the others. A sob caught in her throat. She sat up, pulling the rough blanket to her chest, the desolation of the empty cabin crashing down on her. But then she saw it, on the small crate beside the cot, placed where the cup of water usually sat, was a small, neatly folded handkerchief. It was one of his, clean and smelling faintly of soap and the sun. Hesitantly, she reached for it. It was heavy. She unfolded it. Inside, nestled in the soft white cotton, lay 4 heavy gold eagle coins, gleaming dully in the morning light. It wasn't payment. She knew that instantly, instinctively. Payment was a few coins tossed on a table. This was different. This was a cash, a promise. It was the start of a bride price, a stake for a new life. It was his answer to the question she had been too afraid to ask. It was a silent, solemn vow of responsibility, left in the quiet moments before the dawn. He had called her his bride in the heat of a confrontation, and now, in the cold light of day, he had affirmed it. a secret, like a festering wound, cannot be kept in a small town. Caleb and his men, their pride stung by Elias's cold steel and colder words, rode back to the dusty settlement of Harmony Creek and opened the wound for all to see. The story they told was ugly, twisted with the spite of humiliated men. It spread like a prairie fire, jumping from the saloon to the general store, from the blacksmith's forge to the sewing circles. The tale was not of a man defending a woman, but of a hermit gone mad. A widower who had so lost his senses and his decency that he had taken up with a colored woman. The word they used wasn't bride. It was a coarser term, spat with disgust. The story became an insult to the town itself, and more pointedly, an insult to the memory of Martha, a pale, devout woman whom everyone remembered as the epitome of white piety. Elias wasn't just living in sin. He was desecrating a grave. It took less than a week for the town's self-appointed conscience to act. A buckboard rattled its way up the trail to Elias's homestead, carrying a delegation of 3. Reverend Miller, a man whose soft hands and round belly spoke of a life far removed from hardship. Mrs. Gable, the stony-faced widow of the town's former sheriff and Martha's closest friend. And Mr. Abernathy, the owner of the general store, a man who measured all things, including salvation, in terms of profit and loss. Luzia saw them coming, and her blood ran cold. She was scrubbing the front step, a task she'd taken on with a fierce sort of pride, and the sight of the approaching buckboard filled her with a primal dread. She retreated into the cabin, her heart hammering against her ribs. Elias, who had been oiling a rifle at the kitchen table, looked up, his face hardening into a familiar granite mask. He stood and moved to the door, blocking the entrance with his body. "Elias," the Reverend began, his voice oozing a practiced, syrupy concern as he climbed down from the buckboard. "We've come as friends. We were worried when you didn't attend service last Sunday." "I haven't attended service in 5 years, Reverend," Elias said, his voice flat. "My business with God is my own." Mrs. Gable, her face a thundercloud of judgment, stepped forward. Her black dress seemed to absorb the very light around her. "This is not about your attendance. Elias, this is about your soul. It is about the sanctity of a blessed memory, Martha's memory." Luzia, standing just inside the dim cabin, flinched as if struck. She pressed herself against the rough log wall, wanting to be invisible, yet unable to stop listening. "We have heard disturbing rumors," Mr. Abernathy added, avoiding Elias's gaze and looking instead at his dusty boots. "Rumors of a particular kind of companionship you've taken on. It reflects poorly on the community. Elias, very poorly." "What I do on my own land is my own affair," Elias stated, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "No man is an island. Elias," Reverend Miller insisted, his tone taking on the hectoring quality of a Sunday sermon. "We are a community of believers, and we cannot stand by while one of our own falls into such a lamentable state. To bring a woman of that background into the home you shared with your sainted wife is a stain, a defilement. We are here to implore you, for the sake of your immortal soul and for the honor of the dead, to repent, send this creature away, cleanse your house." "Creature!" The word struck Luzia with the force of a physical blow. She wrapped her arms around herself, a wave of nausea rolling through her. This was it. This was the truth of the world she had foolishly allowed herself to forget. In their eyes, she wasn't a person. She was a contamination, a spiritual sickness that had to be purged. Every kind word from Elias, every shared silence, every tender touch in the dark, it was all a lie, a delusion, because this is what the world saw when it looked at them, a stain, a defilement. "My house is clean," Elias said, his voice shaking with a contained fury. "Cleaner than it's been in years. Now, this is the last time I'll say it. Get off my land." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The menace in his quiet words was more potent than any shout. He stepped back and slammed the heavy wooden door, the sound echoing the finality of a gunshot. The bar dropped into place with a solid, definitive thud. Outside, there was a moment of shocked silence. Then the indignant murmurs of the delegation as they retreated to their buckboard. Lucia heard the rattle of the wheels as they left, the sound of the righteous world turning its back. She stood in the gloom, her body trembling. Elias stood with his back to the door, his fists clenched at his sides. The silence inside the cabin was now worse than the sanctimonious voices had been. It was filled with the poison they had left behind. She was the poison. That night, she went about her evening chores in a daze. She cooked supper, but the food tasted like ash in her mouth. Elias was silent, a thundercloud of a man, his anger a palpable force in the small room. But beneath his anger, she could see the pain. She had brought this on him. Her presence, her very existence, was a weight that was dragging him down, forcing him to fight a world he had long ago retreated from. He had called her his bride to protect her, but in doing so, he had declared war on everything he had once been a part of, and she was the cause. Her love for him, a fragile, beautiful thing that had just begun to bloom in the desert of her heart, now felt like a curse. To truly love him, she realized with a clarity that was as sharp and cold as a shard of glass, was to set him free, to free him from her, from the stain, from the fight, to give him back the peace of his solitude, to restore the honor of the memory she was accused of defiling. Later, as he slept a restless, troubled sleep, she rose from her cot. The moon was a sliver in the sky, offering little light by the faint glow of the dying embers in the hearth. She gathered her few belongings, her spare dress, the skinning knife. She looked at the 4 gold coins, still wrapped in his handkerchief. Her first instinct was to leave them, to prove she had taken nothing. But she was a realist. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. Without the coins, she would be destitute within a day. They were her only chance at survival. She tucked the small, heavy bundle into her pocket. It felt like a betrayal. She stood for a long moment, looking at his sleeping form. In sleep, the hard lines of his face were softened, the pain and anger erased. He looked younger, more vulnerable. An overwhelming wave of love and sorrow washed over her. She wanted to touch him, to trace the line of his jaw one last time. But she didn't dare. Her touch was a contamination. Silently, she mouthed the word goodbye, a word that felt like swallowing broken glass. Then, as quiet as a shadow, she lifted the bar from the door and slipped out into the cold, pre-dawn darkness. Elias woke with a jolt, a sudden, inexplicable sense of wrongness pulling him from a shallow sleep. The cabin was cold, colder than it should have been. The fire was out, but it was more than that. It was an inner cold, a hollowness that felt achingly familiar. He sat up. Her cot was empty. For a second, he thought she might be outside, but her bundle was gone. The cup by her cot was gone. The space she had occupied, which had become the very center of his world, was now a gaping void. A raw, primal panic clawed at his throat. He threw on his boots and shirt, his movements clumsy and frantic. He stormed through the cabin, which now felt like a tomb again, just as it had for 5 long years. The tidy shelves, the clean floor, it all seemed to mock him. He had been a fool to think it could last. The world had come for her, for them, and it had won. He didn't even stop for coffee. He burst out of the cabin and ran to the stable, his heart pounding a frantic, terrified rhythm against his ribs. He saddled his gelding with shaking hands, his mind racing. She had a few hours' head start. On foot, she would head for Harmony Creek. It was the only place to go. She would try to lose herself, find some menial work, disappear. The thought of her, alone and vulnerable in that town, with its judgmental eyes and cruel tongues, was a physical torment. He rode like a man possessed, pushing his horse harder than he ever had before. The rising sun cast long shadows before him, and he leaned forward in the saddle, his eyes scanning the trail, the plains, for any sign of her small, lonely figure. But there was nothing, only the vast, indifferent land. He reached Harmony Creek just after midday, his horse lathered and breathing hard. He didn't slow down, galloping straight down the main street, ignoring the shocked and disapproving stares of the townsfolk. He went past the general store, past the church, and headed for the low-slung, ramshackle buildings on the edge of town, where the people who didn't fit in were forced to live. He found her in a place that smelled of boiled cabbage and ginger, a small eatery, its windows grimy, with Chinese characters painted on a faded sign. He swung off his horse and burst through the door. The room was small and dim. A few Chinese laborers sat at a table, eating silently from bowls of noodles. An old, weary-looking Chinese man stood behind a short counter, and there, standing before him, her back to the door, was Lucia. She was holding a dirty rag, her shoulders slumped, listening as the old man spoke to her in broken English. "Wash dishes, clean floor, hard work," the man was saying. Lucia nodded.
"I understand. I can work hard."
"Elias." She froze at the sound of his voice. She turned slowly, her face a mask of heartbreak and disbelief. Her eyes were swollen, her cheeks tracked with tears. Elias took a step toward her, his chest heaving. The Chinese proprietor looked from Elias's wild, desperate face to Lucia's tear-streaked one and took a prudent step back behind the counter. "You can't be here," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You have to go back. Your honor, your wife's memory." He closed the distance between them, his boots loud on the grimy wooden floor. He looked undone, stripped of all his stoic defenses. The pain and fear on his face were raw, naked. "Honor?" he said, his voice a ragged rasp. He shook his head, a look of utter desolation in his eyes. He reached out and gripped her arms, not hard, but with a desperate, trembling intensity, as if he were afraid she might dissolve into smoke. "They can take it. They can have it. I don't need honor." He looked directly into her eyes, his own burning with a fierce, unwavering light, a truth so powerful it silenced the entire room. "I need you." And with those words, the dam inside her broke. A sob escaped her lips, and she sagged against him. He pulled her into his arms, crushing her to his chest, burying his face in her hair. He held her as if he were holding his own life, his own soul, back from the brink. They stood there, clinging to each other in the middle of that dingy, forgotten room, oblivious to the curious, silent stares of the other patrons. It wasn't a furtive embrace in the dark of a secluded cabin. It was a declaration, made in the light of day, before the eyes of strangers. It was a fortress wall being built, not to keep the world out, but to stand together and face it. Their love would no longer be a secret to be sheltered. It would be their shield. The ride back to Harmony Creek was a different kind of journey. Lucia no longer rode in front of Elias as a rescued waif. She rode her own mare, a gentle sorrel he'd bought for her years ago and kept as a lone companion. They rode side by side, a silent, unified front against the world. His presence was a solid, comforting wall against the furtive, hostile stares that followed them down the town's main street. He was no longer hiding from the world, and she, drawing strength from his resolve, was no longer running from it. Their destination was a small, clapboard building with a faded sign that read, "County Courthouse, Judge T. S. Peters." They stepped from the bright, dusty street into the cool gloom of the courthouse office. It was a single room that smelled of stale paper, ink, and the slow decay of undisputed authority. A thin, balding man with wire-rimmed spectacles sat behind a tall wooden desk, scratching at a ledger with a noisy pen. This was Judge Peters, a man whose entire world was contained within the neat lines of his books, and the rigid letter of the law. He looked up, his expression one of mild annoyance at the interruption. He recognized Elias, his eyebrows rising slightly. It had been years since the reclusive widower had set foot in town for any official business. Then his gaze shifted to Lucia, standing slightly behind Elias, and his face settled into a mask of cool disapproval. Elias, his hat in his hands, stepped forward. His voice was steady, without preamble. "Judge, we've come for a marriage license." The judge put his pen down with deliberate slowness. He leaned back in his chair, its creak loud in the quiet room, and steepled his fingers, looking from Elias's determined face to Lucia's apprehensive one. "A marriage license," he repeated, as if the words were a foreign language. "For whom? Elias?" "For myself," Elias said, placing a hand on the small of Lucia's back. A simple, possessive gesture of ownership and protection. "And for Lucia." Judge Peters let out a short, dry chuckle, a sound devoid of all humor. "Elias, you cannot be serious. You know the law as well as I do. The territorial statutes are quite clear on the matter. Section 14, Article 3. He recited the words from memory, his voice a droning monotone. "All marriages between a white person and a Negro or mulatto shall be forever null and void." He looked directly at Lucia, his eyes cold and assessing. "This woman, she is not white." It was not a question. It was a verdict, a final, insurmountable judgment. "She is a free woman. I am a free man," Elias countered, his voice low and tight. "This is my decision." "Your decision does not supersede the law of the land," the judge said, his tone turning sharp. He was no longer speaking to a neighbor, but to a transgressor. "The law is in place to maintain a proper and moral society. Elias, to prevent the degradation of the races, I cannot and I will not issue such a license. It is an impossibility." He picked up his pen again, a clear act of dismissal. "Now, if that is all, I have work to do." The finality in his voice was like a door slamming shut, locking them out of the world of legitimacy, of normalcy. There was no appeal, no argument to be made. They were standing before the unyielding wall of the law, and it had found them wanting. They walked out of the courthouse and back into the unforgiving glare of the sun. The silence on the long ride home was a heavy, suffocating blanket. The hopeful defiance of the morning had evaporated, leaving behind the bitter residue of defeat. The landscape, which had seemed full of stark beauty on the way in, now looked merely harsh and desolate. Back in the safety of their cabin, Lucia's composure finally shattered. She sank onto her cot, the same cot where she had first awoken in this house, and the tears she had been holding back streamed down her face. They were not tears of anger, but of a deep, profound sorrow, a grief for a life she could never have, a legitimacy she could never claim. "It's me," she whispered, her voice choked with sobs. "I am the thing that is wrong. The law, the town, they are all right. I am the impossibility." She looked up at Elias, her eyes swimming with a pain that tore at his heart. "If only I were white." The words, so full of self-loathing, were a distillation of every insult, every rejection she had ever endured. It was a wish to erase herself, to be remade into someone acceptable, someone worthy. Elias crossed the room and knelt before her. He gently took her face in his hands, his thumbs wiping away her tears. He waited until she met his gaze, his own eyes filled with a fierce, unwavering certainty. "Don't you ever say that," he said, his voice a low, rough command. "Don't you ever wish away the woman I love." He leaned his forehead against hers, their breath mingling in the small space between them. "Lucia, look at what you've done here. You walked into a house that was a tomb and you made it a home. You took a man who was half dead and you made him live again. What you've given me, the warmth in this kitchen, the food that tastes of life, the feel of your hand in mine. What shade of white could ever compare to that? The law is just words in a dusty book. What we have is real. His words were a balm on her wounded soul. She leaned into his touch, her sobs quieting, and a new, stronger resolve began to take root in the soil of her sorrow. The world might reject them, but the world was not here, in this small cabin, on this patch of land. They were the only law that mattered. A few days later, Elias made his own declaration. "We'll have a wedding," he said, his voice firm. "Our own wedding. Here." Their ceremony was held as the sun began to dip below the western horizon, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. Their church was the open prairie, their cathedral dome the vast, endless sky. Lucia wore her spare calico dress, the one she had washed and mended until it was soft as a prayer. She had woven wildflowers from the creek bed into her dark hair. Elias wore a clean shirt, his face scrubbed, the grim lines around his eyes softened with a look of profound, quiet joy. Their guests were a strange and fitting congregation. His old buckskin gelding stood nearby, swishing its tail, a silent, stoic witness, and, seated on a fallen log, were the only other guests, 2 Ute elders, a man and his wife, people Elias knew from his solitary years, people with whom he had traded goods and, more importantly, a mutual, unspoken respect. The man, whose name was 2 Ravens, was ancient, his face a beautiful, intricate map of wrinkles, his eyes holding the wisdom of the mountains. His wife sat beside him, wrapped in a colorful blanket, her presence a silent, powerful blessing. They, too, were outcasts in the white man's world, and their attendance was an act of solidarity, a recognition of a union that existed according to older, deeper laws than those written in Judge Peters's books. There was no preacher, no holy book. Elias took Lucia's hands in his. "Before this land, and under this sky, and with these true witnesses," he said, his voice clear and strong, carrying on the evening air, "I take you, Lucia, as my wife. My home is your home, my life is your life. From this day until the end of my days." Lucia looked into his eyes and saw her past, her present, and her future all reflected there. "And I take you, Elias," she answered, her voice trembling but true. "As my husband, my heart is your heart, my life is your life, forever." 2 Ravens gave a slow, solemn nod, and that was all. They were married. Their wedding night was not a frantic, desperate collision like the first time. That had been about survival, about 2 people clinging to each other in the dark. This was different. This was a celebration. It was the culmination of a promise, the crystallization of freedom and hope. Inside the cabin, which she had filled with more wildflowers, he undressed her slowly, reverently. Every touch was deliberate, worshipful. This was his wife, a truth that resonated deeper than any legal document. This was their act of consecration, a sacrament they administered to each other. There were no more ghosts in the room, no more shadows of the past or fears of the future. There was only the here and now, a sacred space they had carved out for themselves against the world. Their union was a slow, deep, and joyful exploration, a rediscovery of each other not as survivors, but as partners. It was the purest form of communication they had, a language of touch and breath that spoke of love, of acceptance, of a profound and unshakable belonging. As they lay together afterward, skin to skin in the moonlight that streamed through the open window, the world and its ugly classifications fell away in the quiet intimacy of their marriage bed. She was not mixed race, and he was not white. The cruel labels the world used to divide people were meaningless sounds, forgotten words from a foreign country. They were simply a man and a woman, 2 souls, once broken and adrift, who had found their harbor, their home, their entire world in each other's arms. The feeling was not one of passion, but of a peace so deep and absolute it felt like grace. They belonged, finally, and completely. They belonged. The months that followed their wedding were a quiet season of creation. The homestead, once a bastion of solitude, became a shared territory of hope. They worked side by side under the vast, indifferent sky, their movements a practiced, silent ballet. Elias cleared more land, his axe ringing in the clear air, while Luzia expanded her garden, her hands coaxing life from the stubborn soil. They were not just building a farm, they were building a world, a small, defiant kingdom of two, its borders defined by the reach of their love and the sweat of their brows. The bitterness of Harmony Creek faded to a distant hum. They were self-sufficient, needing nothing from a town that had cast them out. Their life was measured in the slow turning of the seasons, the sprouting of corn, the setting of the sun. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, his hand resting on her knee, and watch the stars ignite in the deepening twilight. In these moments, it was easy to believe that their small world was the only one that existed, that the hatred beyond their fences was nothing more than a bad dream. But hatred, unlike a dream, does not fade with the morning light. It waits, it festers, it seeks the darkness to do its work. It came on a moonless, windless night in late autumn. The air was dry, the prairie grass cured to a crisp, golden tinder. They were asleep, wrapped in each other's warmth. When the smell first crept into the cabin, acrid, sharp, and invasive, it was the smell of malice. Elias was the first to wake, his senses, honed by years of solitude and survival, screaming a warning. He sat bolt upright, sniffing the air. "Smoke!" he rasped, his voice thick with sleep. Luzia was awake instantly, her heart leaping with a primal fear. This wasn't the familiar, comforting smell of their own hearth. This was something wild and hungry. Elias threw back the blanket and went to the door, flinging it open. The night was on fire. A roaring, incandescent wall of orange and red was sweeping across their land, moving with terrifying speed. It was not a distant line on the horizon. It was a hungry beast, already devouring the fields they had so painstakingly cleared, its greedy orange tongues licking at the edges of the yard. And it was not a natural fire. It was burning in a perfect, deliberate arc, a fiery sickle meant to encircle and consume their home. "They've fired the prairie," Elias said, his voice a low, guttural sound of disbelief and rage. For a moment, they were paralyzed, two small figures silhouetted against a vision of hell. The roar was a physical presence, a deafening, constant wave of sound. The heat rolled over them, stealing the breath from their lungs. "The horses!" Luzia screamed, breaking the spell. They ran. Elias sprinted for the corral, his long john stark white against the infernal glow, shouting and waving his arms to turn the terrified animals out, to drive them away from the flames toward the relative safety of the creek bed. Luzia's mind raced, a frantic inventory of their life. Everything they had built, everything they owned, was in the cabin. But there was something else. In the small, sturdy shed they had built next to the stable, a place for tools and supplies, was a locked wooden chest. It held the seeds she had painstakingly saved from her garden, the hope for the following spring, and beneath them, wrapped in oilcloth, were the few precious things she had from her mother: a silver locket, a small, embroidered cloth, the only tangible links to a life before this one. "The seeds!" she cried out to Elias, who was now a frantic figure wrestling with the corral gate. "In the shed!" "Leave it! It's not worth it!" he yelled back, his voice nearly lost in the roar. But she couldn't. It wasn't just seeds and trinkets. It was their future and her past. It was everything. Believing she had a moment, she ran for the shed. The air was thick with smoke, stinging her eyes and choking her. Sparks and burning embers rained down around her, small, malevolent stars falling from the sky. She reached the shed, her hands fumbling with the latch on the door. It was hot to the touch. She wrenched it open and plunged into the smoky darkness inside. She found the chest, her hands recognizing its familiar shape. It was heavy, heavier than she remembered. She dragged it toward the door, her lungs screaming for air. her eyes streaming. When she got to the doorway, she stopped, a gasp of pure terror catching in her throat. In the few seconds she had been inside, the fire had leaped from the stable roof to the shed. The doorway was no longer an escape. It was a frame for the apocalypse. A heavy burning beam from the roof collapsed, crashing down and partially blocking the exit. A fiery portcullis. She was trapped.
"Elias!"
she screamed, her voice a raw, desperate shriek. Through the smoke and flames, she saw him turn. She saw the moment he realized where she was. His face, illuminated by the fire, was a mask of pure horror. He had just released the last of the horses and was starting to run toward the cabin, but he changed direction without breaking stride, charging directly toward the burning shed, toward her.
"Lucia!"
His voice was a raw agony that cut through the roar of the flames. He didn't hesitate. He plunged through the curtain of heat and smoke. A blast of superheated air met him, searing his lungs. He saw her, a terrified figure cowering behind the fallen, burning beam. "Get back," he commanded. Without regard for his own flesh, he put his shoulder to the end of the smoldering timber and heaved. The wood was immensely heavy, and the fire bit at him, his shirt catching a spark, his hands blistering as he found purchase on the burning wood. With a great guttural roar of effort and rage, he shoved the beam aside, clearing a path just wide enough to pass. "Now go!" he yelled. She scrambled through, dragging the chest behind her. He pushed her from behind, shielding her body with his own, and they stumbled out of the collapsing structure and into the relative safety of the yard, collapsing onto the scorched earth, coughing and gasping for air. The roof of the shed caved in with a deafening crash, sending a fountain of sparks and flames into the smoke-choked sky. They lay there for a long moment, simply breathing. Elias's hand, the one that had pushed the beam, was a mess of angry red burns, the skin already beginning to blister. He barely seemed to notice. He was looking at her, his eyes wild with a mixture of terror and overwhelming relief. He pulled her close, holding her tight against him, as they watched their world burn. The fire raged through the night, a monstrous, living thing. There was nothing they could do but watch from the safety of the creek bed as it consumed everything. The cabin, their sanctuary, their defiant stand against the world, put up a brave fight, but its dry wooden walls were no match for the inferno. It was devoured, room by room, until, with a final, heartbreaking groan, the roof collapsed inward, and it was gone. Dawn broke on a scene of utter desolation. A gray, greasy light filtered through a sky still hazy with smoke. Where their home had been, there was now only a blackened, smoking rectangle of earth. The fields were a sea of black ash. The stable and the shed were heaps of charred timber. The world was silent, save for the whisper of the wind moving through the ruins. Only one thing remained standing, stark and defiant against the gray sky, the stone fireplace and chimney, the heart of the home, and beside it, miraculously intact though blackened with soot, was the small, sturdy baking oven whose door Lucia had so carefully rehung. They walked through the ashes of their life, hand in hand. Their feet crunched on the charred remnants of their possessions. Everything was gone. The bed they had shared, the table where they had eaten, the chairs where they had sat in companionable silence. All of it was reduced to ash and memory. They came to a stop in the center of what had been their kitchen. They sank down into the warm ashes, two solitary figures in a landscape of total destruction. Lucia looked at Elias's hand. He had wrapped it in a piece of her petticoat that had been torn during their escape, but she could see the angry, weeping burns. She took his injured hand gently in both of hers, tears finally tracing clean paths through the soot on her cheeks. He looked at her, his face grim but his eyes clear. There was no despair in them, only a deep, unyielding resolve. "They can't beat us, Lucia," he said, his voice hoarse from the smoke. "They can burn our house, but they can't burn this. He squeezed her hands with his good one. "We'll build it again, stronger." She looked from the ruins of their home to the fierce love in his eyes and nodded, the tears still falling. "Yes," she whispered. "We'll build it again." They sat there for hours as the sun climbed higher, holding hands amidst the ruins, their silent vow a more sacred thing than any prayer. Later that day, as they were salvaging what few iron tools and pots had survived the blaze, they heard the sound of an approaching wagon. Elias stiffened, his good hand instinctively going to the colt he'd managed to retrieve from the ashes, its wooden handle charred. But it wasn't a mob. It was a single, rickety wagon pulled by a sway-backed mule and driven by a familiar figure. It was Silas Weaver, a stooped, elderly rancher from a spread north of town. Luzia had seen him only once before, months ago. She'd been gathering herbs near the main trail when his horse had stumbled, throwing the old man to the ground. He'd twisted his ankle badly and couldn't stand. She had run to him, helped him back onto his horse, and given him the last of the water from her canteen before leading his horse back to a place where he could manage on his own. He had been gruff, barely managing a thank you before riding off, and she had thought nothing more of it. Now, here he was, pulling his wagon to a stop at the edge of the devastation. He was a man of few words. He spat a stream of tobacco, his eyes taking in the ruin without comment. Then he jerked his thumb toward the back of his wagon. It was loaded with fresh-cut lumber. Piled on top were sacks of nails, a new axe, and 2 shovels. "Heard you had some trouble," Silas grunted, refusing to meet Elias's eyes. "Had this lumber sitting around, taking up space." He paused, then looked directly at Luzia, a flicker of something that looked like grudging respect in his watery blue eyes. A man ought to have a proper roof over his wife's head. Before Elias or Luzia could find their voices to thank him, he had turned his mule around and was rattling back down the trail, leaving his gift behind. His was not the only one. Over the next few days, other small offerings appeared as if by magic at the end of their trail. A basket containing a smoked ham, fresh eggs, and 2 loaves of bread. A wooden crate with 3 nervous but healthy chickens inside. A heavy wool blanket, neatly folded. There were no notes, no names. They were the quiet offerings of those in Harmony Creek who were too afraid to speak out against the loud voices of hate like Caleb's, but whose consciences would not let them remain entirely silent. They were small acts of decency, pushing back against the great, destructive act of prejudice. One evening, as the first stars began to appear, Elias and Luzia stood looking at the growing pile of materials. The lumber from Silas smelled of fresh pine, a scent of new beginnings. Elias was rebandaging his burned hand, the pain a constant reminder of both what they had lost and what he had saved. He looked at the supplies, then at her, a slow, wondering smile touching his lips for the first time since the fire. "You see," he said softly, his voice full of a weary, hard-won hope. "Sometimes, love can change people, too." They did not rebuild on the ashes. The ghosts were too thick there, the ground too soaked in malice. The anonymous gifts of lumber and supplies were not a sign that Harmony Creek had changed its heart, only that a few of its inhabitants still had a conscience. It wasn't enough. Love could change a few people, but it could not, by itself, remake a town built on a foundation of prejudice. So they sold the land for a pittance to a passing speculator, took the gold coins, the kindness of strangers, and the few things they had salvaged from the fire, and they left. They traveled west toward the setting sun, putting miles and mountains between themselves and the past. They were searching not for a particular place, but for a particular feeling, the anonymity of a new beginning. They found it in a town called Redemption. It was a raw, bustling settlement carved out of a high desert valley, a place populated by people who had come to forget who they once were. Here, a person's past was their own business. All that mattered was the work of their hands and the weight of their coin. On a dusty street corner, they found a derelict adobe building that had once been a failed assay office. It was small, sturdy, and overlooked. With the lumber from Silas Weaver and their own relentless labor, they transformed it. Elias, his burned hand healing into a puckered silver scar, rebuilt the walls and roof. Lucia, with an artist's eye, plastered the inside walls and painted them a warm, sun-baked ochre. She insisted on a large window at the front, one that would let the morning light pour in. Months later, a simple, hand-painted sign swung in the breeze above the door. The Sunstone Kitchen. The name was Lucia's. It spoke of the earth and of the light. Their life fell into a new, steady rhythm, a life of quiet industry. The front of the building was the eatery, a small, clean space with 3 wooden tables. The back was their home. Lucia was the heart of the kitchen. From the simplest ingredients, flour, beans, wild herbs, and the occasional cut of meat, she created meals that were honest, flavorful, and deeply comforting. The aroma of her cooking, of fresh bread and simmering stews seasoned with the ghost of her mother's kitchen, became a beacon on the dusty street. Elias, the man who had once shut the world out, found a new purpose in serving it. He was not a natural host, but his quiet, stoic presence inspired a different kind of confidence. He ran a small livery out of the stable behind the kitchen, renting out a few sturdy horses to prospectors and travelers. He would greet his customers with a solemn nod. His words few, but his dealings always fair. Miners, ranchers, and drifters, men who cared little for a person's skin color so long as their cooking was good and their horses were sound, became their regulars. The change in Elias was profound. The deep, settled grief that had carved his features for so long began to recede. Lucia would watch him from the kitchen doorway as he spoke with a customer, and she would see a hint of a smile touch the corners of his mouth, a light in his pale eyes that she had never seen before. He was no longer just surviving. He was living, and she was the reason. Their love, forged in the crucible of fear and desperation, now settled into something deeper and more enduring. It was in the way he brought her a cup of coffee in the pre-dawn quiet before she started her baking. It was in the way she would set aside the best cut of meat for his supper. It was in the shared, knowing glances across a busy room, a silent conversation that no one else could hear. It was a partnership, seamless and strong, built not on grand declarations but on 1,000 small, daily acts of care and devotion. They had found their peace. One late afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, casting long shadows across the street, a young woman appeared in the doorway of the kitchen. She was little more than a girl, her face thin with weariness and want. She was a colored woman, her skin a deep, rich brown, and she clutched a swaddled baby to her chest as if it were the last anchor in a storm-tossed world. Her dress was frayed, her eyes wide with a familiar, hunted look that sent a pang of recognition through Lucia's heart. The kitchen was empty of customers. Elias was in the stable. Lucia was wiping down a table, the scent of cinnamon and baking apples hanging in the warm air. She looked up and her hands went still. It was like looking at a ghost of herself, a reflection from a lifetime ago. The young woman hesitated in the doorway, her gaze darting around the clean, peaceful room as if she expected to be chased out at any moment. "Ma'am," she said, her voice a soft, trembling whisper. I was wondering if you had any work, any at all. I can scrub floors, wash dishes. I'll do anything. My baby, he ain't eaten proper in 2 days." Lucia put down her cloth and slowly walked toward the girl. She saw the raw desperation in her eyes, the sheer terror of a mother unable to provide for her child. She saw the years of fear, of running, of being seen as less than human. She saw her own story, her own journey, reflected in this young, frightened face. She stopped in front of the girl, her expression gentle. She didn't ask her name or where she came from. She didn't need to. She understood the most important parts of her story without a single word. Instead, Lucia looked at the sleeping infant, a tiny, perfect thing wrapped in a thin, worn blanket. "He's beautiful," she said, her voice soft. Tears welled in the young woman's eyes at the simple, unexpected kindness. A single tear escaped and traced a path through the dust on her cheek. Lucia reached out. For a second, the girl flinched, a lifetime of expecting a blow instead of a comfort. But Lucia's hand was slow, deliberate. She didn't touch the baby. Instead, she gently took the young woman's free hand, the one not supporting her child. Her hand was cold, trembling. Lucia's was warm, steady, and strong. She gave the girl's hand a gentle squeeze. Their eyes met, and in that shared gaze, a universe of understanding passed between them. It was a look of shared pain, of shared struggle, but also of shared survival. In Lucia's eyes, the young woman saw not pity, but a profound and powerful empathy. And in the young woman's eyes, Lucia saw not a burden, but a responsibility, a legacy. The light of hope that Elias had given her in the darkness was not meant to be hoarded, but to be passed on. "The first thing we'll do," Lucia said, her voice calm and sure, her hand still holding the girl's, "it's get you and that handsome boy a hot meal. Then we'll talk about work. You can start tomorrow." The story closes on a quiet evening. Weeks later, the sun has set, leaving the sky a bruised purple. The first stars beginning to prick the darkness. The sunstone kitchen is closed for the night, a warm, golden light spilling from its window into the dusty street. Inside, the young woman, Sarah, is humming a soft lullaby as she rocks her baby to sleep in the corner. A full belly and a safe roof over her head, a new and wondrous thing. On the small porch at the back of the building, Elias and Lucia sit side by side on a wooden bench. The air is cool, carrying the scent of pine from the distant mountains and the faint, sweet smell of baking from their kitchen. Elias has his arm around her, and her head rests comfortably on his shoulder. His scarred hand rests on top of hers in her lap. They sit in a comfortable, easy silence, watching the stars grow brighter. Their faces, illuminated by the soft light from the window, are peaceful. The lines of hardship and sorrow softened into a quiet contentment. They have fought their war and survived. They have endured the fire and emerged not unscathed, but unbroken. The world outside their small circle of light is still harsh, still full of judgment and cruelty. The laws have not changed. The hearts of many men are still hard. But here, in this small, forgotten corner of the vast and wild West, a man and a woman who were never supposed to find each other have built a home. They have created a sanctuary, and in the quiet, unyielding strength of their love, they have won. Thank you for listening to this story. We would love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to our channel, From Wild West, and share your thoughts on the story of Lucia and Elias.